Subcommittee will come to order. We'll get fast Congressman Barry Moore, Alabama, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Representative Moore. Without objection, Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Everyone, we welcome you to today's hearing on the fentanyl crisis in America. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Thank you. I thank the members and witnesses for coming today. As you know, this is the first hearing of this subcommittee, this Congress, and I welcome our new and returning members. The business before us today is this hearing, which is entitled "The Fentanyl Crisis in America, Inaction is No Longer an Option." I hope my colleagues will agree that inaction is truly no longer an option concerning this crisis. The first wave of opioid deaths began in the late 1990s with an increase in overdose deaths involving prescription opioids. The second wave began in 2010 with a noticeable rise in overdose deaths involving heroin. The third most recent and deadliest wave began in 2013 with a sharp increase in overdose deaths involving synthetic opioids, particularly illicitly manufactured fentanyl and related substances. Just 2 milligrams of fentanyl, the amount that fits on the tip of a pencil, is considered a potentially lethal dose. As a committee, we began looking at this crisis years ago. We have heard from too many parents who have tragically lost their children to this poison. Between 1999 and 2020, approximately 564,000 people died from overdoses involving an opioid prescription or illicit. In 2021, however, overdose deaths surpassed 100,000, with 67% of those deaths involving fentanyl. Let that sink in. It took 20 years to record a total of 564,000 opioid overdose deaths, and in just 1 year, we saw over 100,000 opioid overdose deaths. You will hear today how communities all across this country are suffering from this poison. During the last 4 years, while we have seen these overdose deaths rise, our colleagues across the aisle have been presented with opportunities to permanently schedule fentanyl-related substances in a bipartisan manner. Instead, they have punted the problem by temporarily scheduling fentanyl-related substances. It is long past time for Congress to permanently schedule fentanyl analogs and other related substances. Unfortunately, my home state of Arizona has become the entry point for much of the illicit fentanyl entering our country. Over half of the fentanyl pills seized by the DEA last year were seized in Arizona. 2 weeks ago, law enforcement seized enough fentanyl to kill nearly 800,000 people. If we can roll that video. This was seized in the suburban Tempe suburb of Phoenix metro area. This was found in just one pickup truck. An individual traveling nearly 150 miles from the border was involved in a single vehicle accident, an auto accident, not a drug bust. When law enforcement arrived, they found 286 pounds, 1.3 million pills of fentanyl. And just this week, another 232 pounds of fentanyl worth $3 million was seized by San Diego Border Patrol from a car in San Clemente, California, 75 miles from the border, most of which were pills. I commend that these drugs were seized, but this just makes me more concerned about how many more of these hundreds-pound hauls we never identify that reach their point of distribution, the point where it can enter American towns, often through the mail, via sales that occur on social media. Now, I know our Democrat friends want us to believe that the farcical notion that all of the fentanyl crossing our borders is coming in through our ports of entry. They have said as much in recent hearings. They want you to believe that we're doing a good job detecting and seizing it before it can enter the country and destroy and take American lives. That's simply not true. And I remind them that it is the fentanyl that is actually seized that is found at legal border crossing points or interior checkpoints. That does not account for fentanyl that is not seized. And in fact, in talking to CBP and other DEA officials, I've been told that the actual amount seized is estimated to be somewhere between 10 and 15% of the overall amount of fentanyl that is being introduced into the United States. If we're being honest, it is the fentanyl that is not seized, obviously, that is killing and endangering our children and other members of our society. To ignore the smuggling that occurs between our ports of entry is simply irresponsible and dangerous. Just last month, Chief Patrol Agent John Maudlin of the Tucson sector testified that, quote, last year we seized about 700 pounds of fentanyl. To give you an idea, that's enough to kill everyone in Arizona 21 times, or half the population of the United States. That was encountered, 52% of that was encountered, so the majority of that was encountered in the field, predominantly being backpacked across a border. I'm going to emphasize that. 52% came across being backpacked across at the border. The other 48% was caught at the administration checkpoint. Will you roll the other tape, please? The video you're about to see takes place in Arivaca, just a few miles off of Nogales, about 70 miles as the crow flies southwest of Tucson. Nowhere near a port of entry, you can see. This is a ranch land. Those backpacks are not because they're going to go camping in the desert. They're bringing in illicit drugs. According to CBP statistics, December was the worst month in our nation's history for illegal migration, as measured by encounters of people. And a huge percentage of the drugs apprehended that month were between the ports of entry. When we talk about being between the ports of entry, we refer to drugs not found at a port of entry. In fact, nearly 9,000 pounds of drugs, or 44% of that month's seizures, were found between the ports of entry, contrary to what you hear from our colleagues across the aisle. Job Dickinson, president of the Border Security Alliance, hit the nail on the head when he said that the cartels have, quote, developed a multi-pronged approach as to how to smuggle illegal drugs into this country. They don't just use one avenue, such as the ports of entry. They also use established smuggling routes and remote parts of the borders to get more drugs across, close quote. Cartels are smart enough to avoid sending their inventory through our X-ray and drug-sniffing dogs at the border. They walk it through the gaping, unguarded holes in our border. The number one sector for opioid smuggling is the Tucson sector. Combating this poison and those who smuggle, manufacture, and sell it should be a bipartisan issue. We need to act together to stop this scourge. I recognize in our audience today Mr. Donald Holman. He previously testified on this topic more than 3 years ago. Tragically, like the Rockwells and too many parents across America, he and his family have been forever impacted by this crisis. Mr. Holman lost his son Garrett in 2017 after he took a synthetic opioid delivered through the mail. Since then, Mr. Holman has courageously been a tireless advocate to keep these dangerous drugs out of our communities. I ask unanimous consent to enter a statement from Mr. Holman into the record, and I thank him for his presence here today. Entered into the record. At this point, I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for her opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and good morning to my colleagues. This is a very important moment, a very serious moment, and a moment of reasoned bipartisanship to fight the scourge of fentanyl. Let me, as I begin, take this opportunity at the outset to express my condolences, Mrs. Rockwell, for the tragic loss of your son, Logan. Thank you for your courage of being here. It is not easy for a mother to speak of the loss of her son. It's not the same thing, but I spent time with the mothers in Uvalde, and it is simply painful. And so your presence here today is a stark reminder, as I said as I walked into this room, that we must be determined to fight the scourge of fentanyl. And we must break the cycle as well of drug addiction, and we must stop the loss of life from this deadly and terrible plague. Thank you for your presence here today. But we must also, as we go forward in this illicit fentanyl, work with our families, work with the nation on drug demands fueled by addiction. We must require the federal government to acknowledge the lessons that they have previously learned, and they must embrace and work bipartisan and include and embrace inclusive strategies that involve aggressive interdiction and community-based treatment. We should not leave families alone. They must have our support. The unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic contributed to the rise in fentanyl-related overdoses beginning in 2019 as treatment, recovery, and prevention services were interrupted and schools, jobs, and mental health support faltered, especially for those suffering from substance abuse disorders. While the previous administration was focused on China building a wall on the southern border, fentanyl came in through the front door and exploded in this country. It is recognizable that China has a major involvement in fentanyl communicating with Mexico. That is, of course, a response that we have to deal with as it relates to that interaction. In 2021, fentanyl was linked to more than 1,600 fatal overdoses in Texas, with African Americans becoming the face of a second national wave of fentanyl-related overdoses. Around the country, many faces were the faces of fentanyl overdoses. Newly released data shows a heightened rate of overdoses in our minority communities, especially among seniors, disproportionately affected by fentanyl addiction, despite an overall decline of overdose rates. Far from the inaction, as the hearing title implies, the Biden administration and Congress have both taken decisive steps to address the scourge of fentanyl. To disrupt the supply chain of fentanyl, Democrats passed the fiscal year 2023 omnibus spending package, which included $60 million to hire 125 additional CBP officers and support personnel at ports of entry, and $70 million to strengthen non-intrusive inspection systems to scan vehicles. I've just come back from the border and talking to our very fine officers. They are working without ceasing. They are going more than the extra mile. We need to give them the resources. They need to be the Superman, Batman, and Mighty Man at the border to be able to assure that fentanyl has a stop sign before it comes into this country. This investment in interdiction resources is critical because the fentanyl supply chain crosses an ocean and several international borders, as I have said. China and increasingly India export most of the chemical precursors to Mexico that are used in the early stages of fentanyl production, where Mexican cartels produce illicit fentanyl products for smuggling to the United States. That is why the Biden administration is working with the Mexican government through several initiatives and redoubling diplomatic efforts to engage China to interrupt the deadly supply chain. Contrary to some expressed opinion, the Mexican cartels primarily use U.S. citizens to drive vehicles and trucks filled with hard-to-detect packages of synthesized fentanyl through lawful ports of entry, while couriers carry and send packages through the U.S. mail and private carriers. We've got to stomp that out. There is one major danger posed by the illicit supply of fentanyl that is particularly troubling: the production of fake or counterfeit pills, which have been found in every state and hold an often deadly secret. It has to be a collective effort. Last year, DEA agents said 4 out of every 10 pills on Houston streets were laced with fentanyl, leading users, including teenagers, to die without knowing what they took. That is why I intend to introduce a bill that will provide grant funding for teachers and other schools to have the necessary adverse drugs that help in other overdose reversal drugs on hand and receive training to administer them properly. My bill will also provide enhanced penalties that do not include mandatory minimums for online sellers and manufacturers of fake pills if death or serious bodily injury occurs. To educate the public, particularly young people and their parents, the Biden administration launched the One Pill Can Kill public awareness campaign to raise awareness of the dangers of fake prescription pills laced with fentanyl. Because the cartels mass produce fake pills to resemble other Schedule II prescription opioids, such as Oxycontin and Percocet, depressants such as Xanax, or stimulants like Adderall, even casual users of illegal drugs can be drawn into the web of the fentanyl trade with deadly consequences. The hard truth is that we can only temporarily disrupt supply of illicit fentanyl temporarily before another cartel, trafficking method, or analog moves in to take over the market that addiction creates. There is scientific basis to this. We're well aware of this chain of events. We can disrupt the flow, but we must also reduce the demand. Far too long, our country has chosen the wrong approach in fighting drug abuse alone. We've left parents and families, communities alone. Criminalizing addiction when people need treatment is a difficult and challenging pathway, and it impacts all of our communities, young and communities of color. That is why in the last Congress we passed the Rural Opioid Abuse Prevention Act, which several Republicans who sit on this very subcommittee voted against. That legislation provided funding to rural communities to combat the fentanyl crisis that they were facing, in addition to $104 million in grants and assistance the Biden administration allocated to the Rural Communities Opioid Response Program. I can assure you, those rural communities welcomed this help that they had not gotten before. It is important to stress that we must not make the same mistakes of fentanyl, fentanyl-related substances, or the synthetic opioids that we have seen happen before and have not gotten the job done. We've got to get the job done. We cannot have mothers coming to tell us the story of their beloved and beautiful child. As we learned through the crack epidemic of the 1980s, followed by amphetamine, the 1990s, and prescription drugs, and back to heroin once again, we cannot incarcerate our way out of this, out of the scourge of fentanyl and synthetic opioids. I'm concerned that banning the entire class of fentanyl-related substances without safeguards significantly may impact what we have to do in research and finding a way to stop this addiction. I also remain opposed to the expansion of mandatory minimums, penalties that prevent judges from considering the unique facts and circumstances of that addicted person who comes before them. According to most recent statistics from the U.S. Sentencing Commission, there are already significant racial disparities in the prosecution of fentanyl trafficking cases, people of color comprising more than 78% of those sentenced in 2021. The same is true for federal convictions involving fentanyl analogs, which 86% of those people were people of color. We must also be reminded that people who are young are the victims, and we must save them because they must have a future. Of those prosecuted for fentanyl trafficking, less than 5% received a guideline increase for a leadership or supervisory role, and less than 10% of those prosecuted for fentanyl analog trafficking received a leadership or supervisory increase. There is no doubt that we're currently experiencing a crisis, but it is a crisis that Congress and the Biden administration have responded to with urgency and clear eyes, and I would certainly like to emphasize that we should do so on this committee. Just a statistic, in the past year, CBP seized over 260,000 pounds of illicit drugs at the border, including more than 13,000 pounds of fentanyl. In December 2022, as we passed the fiscal year, as I reported, we did $60 million, and we reported another $70 million to strengthen non-intrusive inspection systems that scan vehicles and cargo to disrupt the flow of drugs. We are working intensely. And of course, it shows that Customs and Border Protection data shows that since fiscal 2020, more than 90% of fentanyl, heroin, and amphetamine seizures occurred at U.S. ports of entry, with almost 97% of all fentanyl seizures happening at ports of entry this fiscal year. We are working to stop the death. And in 2021, U.S. citizens accounted for 86.3% of fentanyl trafficking convictions, compared to just 8.9% of undocumented migrants. Let's get the facts to save lives. Therefore, let's work together. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I hope to have an earnest discussion about solutions to reduce the supply of fentanyl and combat and prevent addiction, and overdoses. We must save lives. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Ranker. Mr. Nadler. Former Mr. Chairman, I now recognize you for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, over 100,000 Americans are dying of drug overdoses each year. Most of these deaths are from fentanyl. The seriousness of the fentanyl crisis cannot be denied. That is why Democrats have been working on solutions to address fentanyl trafficking, addiction, and overdose since it emerged as a threat to our communities. Last Congress, under a Democratic majority, we passed multiple bills to address the opioid epidemic. We passed the Rural Opioid Abuse Prevention Act, which expanded grant eligibility to fund pilot programs in rural areas that focus on reducing overdose deaths. We passed the Bipartisan Fentanyl Results Act, which authorizes 2 State Department programs that combat global drug trafficking. As part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act, we enacted 2 bills that make it easier for providers to offer addiction treatments that combine medication with other services. And we passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which included $430 million to modernize our ports of entry and help improve CBP's ability to detect illicit drugs. Much of this legislation was bipartisan, but the Republicans on this subcommittee seem to have forgotten that work, and some of them actively opposed it. They titled this hearing "The Fentanyl Crisis in America. Inaction is no longer a problem." Republicans suggest that there has been no action to address this crisis, but they could not be more wrong. There has been action in Congress and by the Biden administration. Some Republicans would prefer different actions. Some Republicans want to incarcerate our way out of this problem, but we know from past experience that this simply does not work. Drug prosecutions generally catch low-level dealers, but very rarely reach the leaders of trafficking organizations. Since cartel leaders can often recruit new dealers, more arrests and longer sentences for low-level dealers does not stop the flow of drugs into our communities. Other Republicans say tough immigration policies and a border wall can stop fentanyl, but the facts are not on their side. While it is true that a great deal of fentanyl comes into the United States from Mexico, it is overwhelmingly U.S. citizens, not migrants, who are bringing it in. Fentanyl is not carried across the border in the middle of the desert, generally. It is driven in commercial trucks and passenger vehicles passing through legal ports of entry. That's why Democrats have supported investments in more law enforcement tools to detect illicit drugs. The fentanyl crisis cannot be used as another justification for mass incarceration or an excuse for harsh immigration policies that do nothing to prevent addiction. While fentanyl is especially deadly, addiction and overdose are not new. We must learn from the failures of our past and treat the fentanyl crisis not as a crime problem, but as a public health problem. We must get to the root causes of addiction and substance abuse, or we will end the war on fentanyl only to have a war on the next, even deadlier drug. We have begun to better understand the nature of addiction, and the public health approach is beginning to take hold. We have shifted the focus from how do we lock more people up to how do we save more lives. This shift has led us to get overdose prevention drugs like naloxone or Narcan to more first responders and more community members. These drugs are saving hundreds of thousands of lives. We are also making sure that those who do come into the criminal justice system because of their addiction receive appropriate treatment, whether through diversion programs that help people rejoin the community without incarceration or through treatment while incarcerated. These programs are not just about helping individuals suffering from addiction. They improve our communities because those who receive treatment are less likely to commit crime and more likely to find employment. Fentanyl continues to be a crisis. It is a crisis that members of both parties are working to address. Today, I hope we can explore more actions we might take together to prevent addiction and get to the root causes of drug abuse. I welcome our colleagues' concern about this issue. I hope they are sincere in their interest in joining this effort. Thank you, Mr. Chair.